In this video, I'm going to share with you how I choose which exercises to include in my program. There are a lot of different exercises to choose from. And that being so, I know it can sometimes be tough to know exactly which exercises are best for you to include. To help you out a bit, I'm going to share with you a set of criteria that I've created for myself that helps me decide which exercises to include on my own program. I'm also going to share with you different examples of exercises that I'm currently including and how each of those exercises fits my own criteria. Just before we get started, it would be super appreciated if you like this video. Each like really helps the growth of this channel. Your support means a lot. All right, let's dive in. When choosing which exercises to include in my program, I look to the following list of criteria. Does the exercise allow me to move with maximal depth? Do I feel the muscle that I'm targeting? Is the limiting factor of the exercise my target muscle? Do I get a pump from performing the exercise? Is the exercise boring? Does the exercise leave my joints and connective tissue feeling pain-free? Here's a quick explanation of each piece of criteria. Moving with maximal depth refers to being able to elongate a muscle as much as possible. When a muscle moves under load in its most stretched position, it gets lots and lots of stimulus for muscle growth. So if the exercise doesn't allow for this, then it might mean missing out on some gains. Feeling the muscle that I'm targeting refers to experiencing some kind of tension on the muscle that I'm targeting. This could also be referred to as a mind-muscle connection. The feeling of tension might come in the form of a stretch, burn, blunt force trauma, or some combination of those different sensations. It's worth mentioning that different exercises using different loads and different rep ranges might lead to tension being felt in different ways. The target muscle of an exercise being the limiting factor means you have to stop the set because the muscle that you're targeting experiences an overwhelming amount of tension, rather than a muscle that you're not targeting experiences an overwhelming amount of tension. Getting a pump probably doesn't need much of an explanation, but it's when you can feel and see your muscle filling up with fluid. The feeling leading up to a pump usually comes with a burning sensation, and the feeling of the pump itself usually comes with a feeling of tightness or pressure of your muscles pushing up against your skin. Feeling boredom when performing an exercise usually comes from a lack of the other criteria points being met. If an exercise doesn't leave me feeling tension on my target muscle, for example, it's kind of like the equivalent of me playing the air guitar. A person can only play the air guitar for so long before it starts to get hopelessly boring. And of course, it's undesirable if an exercise leaves my joints or connective tissue feeling sore or inflamed, since that's usually an indicator of an impending injury. Of course, training for muscle growth becomes much more difficult when trying to work around an injury, so experiencing one is pretty undesirable. And that is the list of criteria. Now, here are several examples of exercises that I'm currently including on my program, as well as an explanation as to how they fit my criteria. Quick disclaimer though, these exercises fit my criteria well specifically for me. This might not be the case specifically for you. And on the flip side, there might be some exercises that fit the criteria really well for you and not so well for me. Okay. Here are some of my own personal examples. First example is the leg press. This has been a staple in my program for years, and for good reason. As long as I'm training at a gym with a decent machine, I'm able to move with tons of depth. Not every leg press machine is of high quality though, and some are built in a way that seems to inhibit being able to move with maximal depth. So having access to a good leg press machine is very important if this exercise is to meet my criteria. I feel an overwhelming amount of tension on my target muscle, which is my quads, in the form of a combination of blunt force trauma and burning.
Whoa!
I do feel a stretch at the bottom of each rep, but mostly in my adductors, which is my inner thigh muscles, more so than my quads. I'm cool with that though, since the development of my inner thighs will lead me to developing even more impressive 3D looking legs. My quads are indisputably the limiting factor of each set. There's no denying that. I get an absolute ridiculous pump in my quads after each set, so there's no question there. Because the exercise is so challenging and the amount of tension that I feel on my quads is so high, I might not exactly consider it to be fun, but it is certainly not boring. And lastly, as long as I'm moving with good technique and keeping every rep in the pocket, then I seldom feel soreness or inflammation in my connective tissue or joints. So the leg press passes my criteria with flying colors. All right, next up is the bent over dumbbell row. My upper back has been one of the weaker muscle groups on my body, so I've been extra picky about my exercise selection to try to bring that muscle group up in particular. This exercise allows me to fully stretch out my arms and even allow my upper back to round a little bit to fully elongate my traps and rhomboids. I get a strong feeling of tension along my upper back, especially as a stretch at the bottom of each rep, and overall blunt force trauma as I make my way through each set. I do also feel a burn, but maybe a little bit less intensely than I do for other exercises like, say, the leg press. The limiting factor of the exercise is definitely my upper back muscles, and I'll usually finish each set off with at least a few lengthened partials. I do get a bit of a pump, but again, not quite as strongly as an exercise like the leg press. I actually really look forward to the challenge and the tension that comes from this exercise, so I certainly don't feel a sense of boredom from performing it. As long as my technique stays tight and I stay focused enough to maintain my body's structural integrity, then I seldom feel any issues on my joints or connective tissue when performing this exercise. Bent over dumbbell rows get a big A+ from me. Okay, now here's a very interesting exercise example that doesn't actually check off every point of my criteria. And that example is Romanian deadlifts. The exercise allows me to move with maximal amounts of depth, especially when I stand on an elevated platform. And I feel massive amounts of tension, especially as a stretch sensation at the bottom of each rep. Now here's where things get interesting. The limiting factor of the exercise is actually a toss-up between my hamstrings and my spinal erectors. By the time I get to the last several reps of each set, I have to really fight to maintain my body's structural integrity, mainly fighting to keep my spine or my back from rounding over. It's my spinal erectors that are mainly responsible for that job, which leaves them being a prospective limiting factor of the exercise. That being so, my hamstrings almost always seem to, at the very least, get very close to their failure point at around the same time as my spinal erectors do. I think the stronger and more skilled I get at the exercise, the more the gap closes between when my hamstrings and my spinal erectors fail. Despite there being some ambiguity here, my hamstrings are close enough to being the limiting factor that I deem this exercise being more than worth including, even though I can't check off this point of criteria with complete certainty. This next point is interesting too. I don't really get much of a hamstring pump either at high or low rep ranges when performing the exercise. The pump isn't exactly a requirement for muscle growth. So when it isn't there, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't any stimulus for muscle growth. And because my perceived feeling of tension on my hamstrings is so high, I think that probably warrants the lack of pump on my hamstrings as being an exception. And for the next point, because of the immense challenge that comes with performing RDLs and the massive amount of tension that I do feel on my hamstrings, I rarely get bored of performing them. And lastly, as long as I keep my technique tight and I maintain my body's structural integrity, then I rarely experience soreness or inflammation in my connective tissue and or joints. Here's another interesting exercise choice. Incline dumbbell lateral raises superset with dumbbell overhead presses. Like my upper back, my shoulders have also been a weaker muscle that I've been trying to bring up. And this superset combo absolutely nukes my delts. Both the lateral raises and the overhead presses allow me to move with maximal depth to get a deep stretch in my shoulders, especially with the lateral raises. Check. I feel tons of tension on my shoulders when performing both movements as well. Also check. The angle of the lateral raises leaves me feeling a super deep stretch, probably from a combination of elongating both my delts and my rotator cuff muscles. And moving directly from the lateral raises to the overhead presses leaves my delts really feeling the fire, since they're already fatigued from having done the lateral raises first. The tension is undeniable. The limiting factor of the exercise is undoubtedly my delts as well. Including the dumbbell overhead press as the second exercise of this superset combination is for this exact reason. See, it's not always the case when I start fresh with the dumbbell overhead presses, as that often leaves me with my triceps being the limiting factor. I get a massive pump at the end of each superset, so a big check mark there. I definitely don't get bored of this superset combination with the massive challenge that comes with it, as well as the overwhelming feeling of tension. And lastly, neither exercise feels injurious on my joints or connective tissue. However, I have really found that it's worth being very cautious not to lift too heavy, especially with this variation of lateral raises. When I have experimented lifting with a little bit heavier of loads, I do start to find that I get some suspicious pain around my shoulder joints and connective tissue. So using lighter loads with mid to high rep ranges for this variation of lateral raises is probably best to minimize any risk of injury.
Wait! Yeah!
Okay, now you might be wondering,
how do you decide between multiple exercises that each score high on your list of criteria?
Really great question. The answer is, I'll usually opt to pick the exercise that simply scores highest on that list of criteria. Here's an example. I love free weight barbell back squats, and they do score quite highly on my list of criteria. That said, I've opted to include the leg press, Bulgarian split squats, and hack squats as my main squat pattern quad building movements instead of free weight barbell back squats. And here's the reason for that. I simply feel less overall tension on my target muscles, which are my quads, when I perform barbell back squats compared to the other exercises that I just mentioned. On top of that, because my quads are pretty strong at this point, I usually need to load quite a bit of weight on the barbell to get a good stimulus when I perform the exercise. And by adding a decent amount of load to the barbell, it tends to make the exercise a little bit more injurious. You might be thinking,
well, hey, why don't you just perform the exercise with less weight and do more reps instead?
And that's a great point. The reason I don't do that is because when performed at higher rep ranges, barbell back squats usually leave my cardiovascular system as being the limiting factor of the movement rather than my quads, which probably isn't ideal for muscle growth of my quads.
Which walls are natural sprinters!
If I really wanted to include barbell back squats in my program, what I could do is opt to include a pre-fatigue exercise before I perform them, like leg extensions, so that by the time I get to the squats, I won't need to load as much weight on the barbell to get a good stimulus. That could do the trick perfectly. Even so, for me personally, the prospect of doing that just doesn't sound fantastic to me. And at the end of the day, I'd just rather include the leg press, Bulgarian split squats, and hack squats instead. They honestly just work great. This does not mean that barbell back squats are at all an inferior exercise when it comes to building your quads. In fact, I spent well over 10 years, including barbell back squats, as a staple to my program. And that being so, it's likely that a huge portion of my quad development has come from doing that exercise. If you feel that you get a lot out of barbell back squats and that they meet all of the points of my criteria and that you just enjoy doing them, then my goodness, I would keep doing them. And that's it. I'm curious. Are there any exercises currently on your program that seem to check off all of the points on my criteria? Let me know in the comments. I want to say a big thank you for sticking around and watching this entire video, and I hope that you found it helpful. If you liked the video, please like it, and of course, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one. Thank you again, and as always, lift hard, lift smart, and I'll see you in the next video.